This is Dr. Momcilovic's Lecture 6.2 on seed plants. In our last lecture, we talked about non-vascular seedless plants, which were mossids. We talked about vascular seedless plants, which were things like ferns. And today we're going to talk about seeded vascular plants, which are things like gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are going to be things that have cones like pine trees and fir trees and juniper trees, and angiosperms, which are all plants that have flowers. In land plants, the evolution of pollen and seeds was a very important adaptation for plants that were living on land. The evolution of those two structures allowed plants to diversify into many different ecosystems and types of environments that were further away from water. Pollen is the male gametophyte and is protected by a protein wall. The protein walls in different types of pollen are so diverse that we can actually look at different types of fossilized pollen to see what types of plants would have been alive at that time. The different structures of the pollen also make it so that pollen can only fertilize the egg cells of the correct types of plants. So we see a variety of different wall structures in the pollen of different species of seeded plants. The pollen that's produced can be transported through various pollinators. That can be things like wind, animals, water, etc. Seeds are the embryonic plant. They consist of maternally derived tissue, and that feeds and protects the embryo. Seeds also have diverse adaptations for dispersal, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth. The first type of seeded plant to evolve, and the first one that we're going to discuss, are called the gymnosperms. Living gymnosperms are a monophyletic group. Gymnosperms mean naked seeded, so the ovules and the seeds are not protected by ovary or fruit tissue like we see in angiosperms. These types of plants evolved in the late Carboniferous period about 319 million years ago. Of the living gymnosperms, there's quite a bit of diversity. The most speciose group is the Pinophyta, which includes things like conifers and pines, which are about 600 species. The Cycadophyta, which are things like cycads, have about 340 species. The Cnidophyta include things like the Cnidum, Ephedra, and the Welwitschia. That has about 100 species. And then there's the Ginkgophyta, which includes one species, which is called the Ginkgo balboa. And it has only one living species in that group of Ginkgophyta. The first type of gymnosperm that we're going to discuss in more detail are the cycads. These, at first look quite a bit like ferns, which we discussed in the last lecture. But if you were to touch the leaves of a cycad, they're actually very thick and stiff in comparison to the soft and sort of typical leafy feel of a fern leaf. Cycads are very slow growing. They have very stiff evergreen leaves, meaning that they generally are green year-round. And they are dioecious, meaning that they have separate male and female plants. Unlike ferns, which we talked about have spores that are produced on the bottom side of the leaves, cycads actually have cones that they produce, and they will either produce male or female cones depending on what the plant is. And those cones, if it's a male plant, will produce pollen, and female cones will have eggs, and the pollen from the male cycads will travel to where the female cones are for fertilization. The second group of gymnosperms are the ginkgos. And like we said, there's only one remaining living species of ginkgo, and that's Ginkgo bilboa. This many people consider to be a living fossil because there are identical fossils that are about 270 million years old. However, this one species is the only species that survived in the past 270 million years. Ginkgos are native to Asia. However, they have been used across Europe and the United States in landscaping because they produce really, really beautiful trees. If there is a ginkgo tree in your landscaping or in landscaping somewhere in North America or Europe, it's usually going to be a male ginkgo tree and not a female ginkgo tree. Male ginkgo trees generally only create a small amount of pollen, whereas female ginkgo trees create a lot of small, hard nutules, which are the seeds from those female trees, which can be quite messy. The next type of gymnosperm that we're going to discuss are the cnidophytes. There are 3 genera within the cnidophytes. There's the Welwitschia, the Cnidum, and the Ephedra. Welwitschia are a type of cnidophyte that are endemic to Namibian deserts, and they generally look very ragged and sort of like sad-looking plants because they're very well adapted to the very dry conditions of the desert in Namibia. They will only produce 2 large leaves at one time that sort of spread outward, and then they start to break down. They will also produce a male and female cone that will produce an embryo. Similarly, the ephedra live in the desert southwest. And the ephedra plant was the original source of ephedrine in Sudafed. The ephedra plant was originally used by Native American peoples as a medicinal plant, and the pharmaceutical industry figured out ways to use that in modern medicine. The last type of gymnosperm are the conifers, and these are probably the types of gymnosperms that you are more familiar with. So these are things that are evergreens. So on a conifer, the leaves can be long and needle-like, like something you would see on a fir or a pine tree, or it could be sort of scaly, like you would see on a juniper or a cypress tree. Conifers are wind pollinated, meaning that their pollen is very lightweight and gets picked up from the wind and then travels over to another tree and fertilizes that tree. Trees of this type will make both male and female cones. You'll usually find the male cones higher up on the tree and the female cones lower down on the tree. The male cones are located at the top of the tree so that they have a better chance of being picked up by the wind and carried over to a female cone. And the female cones are located lower to have a better chance of being able to come in contact with that male pollen that's floating on the air. Most conifers are monoecious, but some are dioecious. In the alternation of generations in conifers, the sporophyte stage is the dominant stage in the alternation of generations compared to the gametophyte stage. So the large tree that you see is the sporophyte. The male sporophyte will create male gametophytes, which are the pollen grains, which fertilize the female gametophyte, and then the embryo are the developing seeds. So when you eat something like a pine nut, you're actually eating the embryos of a tree. The other type of seeded vascular plants are the angiosperms. Angiosperms have flowers. They also have a seed with an endosperm, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and they produce fruits. The first flowering plants showed up in the Cretaceous period about 140 million years ago. There are about 300,000 species of angiosperms, making them the largest group of plants that are living on the planet today. There are a couple different types of angiosperms. There are the basal angiosperms, which include things like water lilies, and then there are what we call the core angiosperms. Within the core angiosperms, we're going to talk about the two most speciose groups, which are the monocots, which have about 70,000 species, and the eudicots, which have about 175,000 species. About the same time that angiosperms were diversifying, insects were also diversifying. And so we think that what happened is that there was a coevolution between angiosperms, which again are flowering plants, and insects, where the number of flowering plants and the diversity allowed for the diversity of insects to grow and vice versa. The number of insects were there to pollinate and use the different parts of the flowering plants, and so they co-evolved together and sort of enhanced the evolution of those two groups. Within the angiosperms, the two types, like I said, that we're going to talk about are the monocots and the eudicots. Monocots include a lot of things that most people on the planet base their entire diet around. So there are things like grasses, rice, wheat, those are all monocots. Also onions, lilies, and bananas, those are all different types of monocots. When you are looking at a plant, you can tell whether it's a monocot or a eudicot through a few different mechanisms. The first would be that the veins are usually parallel in the leaves of a monocot, as well as there is the cotyledon within an embryo, which in a monocot is only a single cotyledon. A cotyledon is an embryonic leaf that is surrounded by endosperm, which is nutritional tissue that's derived from the ovary of the plant. Monocots also have vascular tissue that is scattered. So it's the xylem and phloem that we talked about in the last lecture that is scattered throughout the stem. The root system of a monocot is usually fibrous, so it doesn't have a large main root. It just has a lot of small branching roots. Pollen grains of monocots have only one opening, and the floral organs are usually in multiples of 3. So the leaves, the anthers, the stamens, all those things, all the different parts of a flower are usually in multiples of 3. Sorry, not the leaves, the petals, if I said leaves. The petals of the flower are usually in multiples of 3. So you'll see 3, 6, or 9 petals on the flowers of monocots. Eudicots include other types of things that we eat often, as well as a lot of flowers that we use in gardening. So eudicots include things like tomatoes, papayas, apples, oranges, zucchini, as well as roses, daisies, and sunflowers. It also includes things like eggplant, and the list sort of continues. So eudicots look a little bit different than monocots in several ways. The veins in the leaves of a eudicot are usually net-like instead of parallel. And then in the embryo of a eudicot, it has 2 cotyledons, meaning it has 2 embryonic leaves surrounded by an endosperm. In the stems of a eudicot, the vascular tissue is arranged in a ring, and the root usually has one main root called a taproot that has a bunch of small branching roots off of it. So it would be something like a carrot. If you guys do gardening at all, a carrot has one long root with a bunch of small branching roots off of it. The pollen grain on a eudicot has 3 openings, and the floral organs, including the petals on a flower, occur in multiples of 4 or 5. So on a eudicot flower, you would see 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 or 16 or 20 petals on the flower. And that is one way that you can tell that it's a eudicot. So in the flowers of angiosperms, there are a few different structures that we need to talk about in a little bit more detail. So what we call a perfect flower would have both male and female gametophyte production. So it would have both male and female flower parts within the flower. The female flower part is called the pistil. The pistil is comprised of a stigma, a style, and an ovary. The stigma is sticky, and it is a landing place for pollen. The pollen will grow a pollen tube down through the style, which is that long tube, and once it makes its way down the style, the pollen will then transfer down into the ovary and fertilize the ovule that's in the ovary. The male part of the flower is called the stamen. The stamen includes the anther, which is the part of the flower that creates pollen, and then it also has the filament, which keeps the anther up and in the correct position for either an insect or a bird pollinator or for wind. And so the position of the anther within the flower depends on the way that that type of flower is pollinated. It will be oriented correctly to make sure that the pollen gets dispersed however its pollinators disperse it. So this link will take you to a site that will give you a little bit more information and some practice on the different parts of a flower. The production of sperm and eggs is a little bit more complicated than what we've been discussing so far. So in angiosperms, within the ovary of the plant, there are smaller sections and smaller cells that are called macrospore ovules. Each of those macrospore ovules will go through meiosis and to create 4 cells, and from those 4 cells, only one of them becomes an egg, and the rest of them become the embryonic tissue that surrounds the egg. In the male part of the flower, in the anther, there are microspores, which are the mother cells that undergo meiosis and create 4 of the pollen cells. And then each of those will go through mitosis to create a generative cell and a tube cell within that pollen grain. The tube cell is the one that will actually grow the tube from the stigma down into the ovule. And those are the pollen grains that are then able to fertilize the egg cells that are created in the ovary of the plant. So this slide is just giving you an idea of how this entire process works in an angiosperm. So the 6 pictures on the left-hand side of the slide show the progression from a stem all the way to a fruit in an angiosperm. So we have a stem, and then it grows some buds. The buds turn into flowers in the 3rd step of the picture. Once the ovules once the egg in the flower gets fertilized, the flower part of the plant falls away, and the ovule starts to turn into a fruit that surrounds that fertilized egg cell. After that once that ovule becomes mature, it's a fruit. In this case, we're looking at something that's a typical stone fruit, like a plum or a nectarine, where you have the fleshy part of that fruit that surrounds the seed in the middle. The seed in the middle is that embryo, and it's surrounded by the fleshy ovule. So when you are eating a fruit, most types of fruit, you're eating the ovule of a female plant, and the seed in the middle that you generally throw away is the embryo that was fertilized by male pollen. So now you get to tell all of your friends and your family that when they're eating fruit, they're actually eating plant ovaries.